I'm Amanda Silver.
And I'm Alex Howard.
And this is Dirty Laundry.
How many embryos did the doctor put into her belly?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, actually, like, she made her own embryo. The doctor didn't make the embryo for her. She made her own embryo. And my daughter was like, what? And I was like, yeah, I know. And it's wild that people can make their own embryo. My daughter is just like totally floored, like, what? She made her own? I agree.
She's a magician.
Well, we have IVF books and books about all kids books. Both my kids are IVF babies and all these things. And literally like a few months ago, I was like, I should buy a book that talks about how to make a baby the sex way.
Right. Because they probably think, I'm not going to get pregnant like that. I only get pregnant if I go to a lab.
So
we're good. No
bunch of money.
That's so cute. Actually, that reminds me. Remember we had Nat Reisman on and she was the first test tube baby.
What?
Yeah, remember we talked about that.
No, we didn't.
And I don't know if it was like in Toronto or in Ontario.
We never talked
we'll have
about
to
this.
fact check that. But yeah, so that was like her claim to fame. So
She's the first one?
Yeah.
Wow.
Her parents were like very progressive. Yeah, she's
Bionic Nat.
She's like our age. Yeah,
She's always
late 30s. So I guess it was
That's so
pioneering
cool.
technology back 40 years ago. But anyways,
Well, fertility is such an interesting topic, and it's so timely because I think that you go on socials and every influencer over the age of 32 is freezing their eggs.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a trend or if it's and they're doing it so young.
I mean, I guess the younger you do it, the healthier the egg, or is that?
No, that is you have your prime, your primo years of healthy egg production, but it just seems like you got these very, very young women who are thinking ahead, which I guess is smart.
That's very smart.
So we've brought on the fertility law expert, Tracy, here to tell us all about how that works in terms of divorce, separation, estates, all of that.
All of the legal ramifications. So obviously your own journey through your childbearing years kind of influenced where you are today. So you had to go on your own fertility journey and now you are trying to support others going through that from a legal standpoint.
Yeah. So when I started practice, when I started working as a lawyer, my mentor had used a sperm donor to have her kids. And so she became kind of personally interested in fertility law and in the use of, sperm donors, egg donors, surrogacy, things like that. And so I started doing that kind of work with her, along with her. And then it turned out when I tried to have some kids, I needed help. So I started in the fertility treatments. I did some IUIs, didn't have any babies that way, and then did IVF. So I have 2 IVF babies now. I did the whole process. And then, I've just kind of continued to roll with it with the fertility law practice. And now I do, sperm donor agreements, egg donor agreements, embryo donation, surrogacy agreements, in Nova Scotia, which is where I practice. We also, after the birth of a baby by way of surrogate, there's an application to court that happens after that. So we do that process. And then I also do lots of consultation with clients who are in the process of doing fertility treatments, sometimes outside of Canada, and I'll sometimes review contracts and things like that with them. And then also on the separation. When people separate. So my primary practice is that I'm a divorce lawyer, a family law lawyer. Right. And so sometimes people separate when they still have embryos in storage or things like that, and working through that process.
Just adding a whole other layer of complexity to an already difficult and tumultuous
I mean, you talk about,
situation.
we divide assets, we divide, checking accounts and RRSPs, but imagine having embryos frozen. They're already created, right? It's not like you have egg and sperm frozen separately. Right. Each person takes their own and off you go.
Yeah.
These have already been put together, created an embryo. Now what?
So that's when you come in, and then what happens?
typically the fertility clinic, wherever embryos are being made. It's within the regulations of the Assisted Human Reproduction Act, which is applicable right across Canada. That those decisions kind of get made in advance. That you think about it. There's a form that people fill out when their embryos are being made that consider separation or death of one party or things like that, and so people will have filled it out. But I mean, for me personally, I filled out that form in 2017, and I assure you I would have signed anything. Even though I'm a lawyer.
It's kind of like you're kind of under duress, because it's like, what's the alternative? Right?
What's the alternative? And I'm sure that I considered it, and I'm sure that we discussed it briefly, but you know, my husband and I were like, sure, sign the forms.
Well, I mean, you don't enter into a marriage thinking it's going to end in divorce. You don't enter into a fertility journey thinking, oh no, we're not going to actually outlast, you know, the time of this whole journey. So
but
it is, you know, the stats are there, so you have to give some thought to that. It's not a light discussion to have.
I'm curious. No, go ahead, please.
I'm curious what's in that contract. So like, what are the terms sort of that contract that you're signing, you know, with the, you know, the foresight of what would happen if?
Yeah, so fertility clinics, it would be dependent on what their particular contracts say, and I can't remember the particulars of the one that I signed, of course, but it would take into consideration, what are you going to do if you separate? What are you going to do if one party dies before the reproductive material is used? The Assisted Reproduction Act is really clear that if you want your genetic materials to be able to be used after you die, you have to have put it in writing before you die, and before the storage, and it should be before the storage happens in an ideal world.
And are you recommending to your clients that they do contracts or some sort of paperwork in addition to that? No.
That's like
no, not really. I mean, sometimes people will bring those agreements to me and ask, you know, questions or clarification or things like that. Sometimes I'll consult on things like that. But I mean, I wouldn't say if you wanted to have like a marriage contract and includes your frozen embryos, things like that, sure, you could include them. You could include embryos in that.
What are your like typical clients? You said that separation divorces mostly, or you mentioned, you know, other agreements, sperm and egg agreements.
Yeah, so my main part of my practice is that I'm a family law lawyer. I do, you know, divorces, separations, child support, custody, parenting and support agreements, that kind of stuff. But I do have a part of my practice in fertility law. And so the things that I do in that would be egg donor agreements, sperm donor agreements, surrogacy agreements, and work with different clients. Most of my clients are in Nova Scotia. I practice in Nova Scotia. But sometimes if I'm working on a file with surrogacy, the intended parents might be outside of Nova Scotia and the surrogate's in Nova Scotia. If the baby's going to be born in Nova Scotia, then the intended parents might not be in Nova Scotia, might not be in Canada at all. Canada is a country that is sometimes, like, international intended parents have babies born by surrogacy in Canada. And there's some reasons for that. One of the reasons being that in Canada you can't pay surrogates. You can't pay for reproductive materials, and so surrogates are reimbursed for any expenses that they have relating to their surrogacy, but they aren't actually paid a fee. And so that's one reason international parents might use Canadian surrogates, and another reason being that babies are obtain Canadian citizenship upon birth. And so some international parents might be choosing Canada for that reason. We are welcoming to LGBTQIA families, so there are some countries that it's difficult for queer couples to access surrogacy. That's mostly two men. A family of two women is rarely using a surrogate. They generally have some uteruses to choose from. But a family that is two cis men would would generally require a surrogate. And so sometimes we have international clients who are using Canadian surrogates to have their baby. They'd use an egg donor, a different egg donor than the surrogate, and then use the surrogate. And yeah.
What a journey they have to go through.
I know.
I know, yeah. And it's so
right?
expensive.
So
like the cost of IVF alone is really expensive. And then egg donors and the costs of, associated with the expenses that an egg donor would incur, the expenses that a surrogate would incur, the travel costs for the dads to come. During the depths of COVID, we were asking them to be here even longer in Canada. To ensure that if there were quarantine requirements, that they could meet those quarantine requirements before the birth of a baby.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, lots to consider. And sorry, what's the document that they have to sign for the surrogate then after they deliver?
Yeah, so before a surrogate gets pregnant, before there's any embryo transfers, anything like that, we do a surrogacy agreement, which is just a huge contract that overviews everything that could happen trying to get pregnant during a pregnancy, all the reimbursements, all that kind of stuff. Okay. And then after the birth of a baby in Nova Scotia, we make application to the court for a declaration of parentage. Right. And on that declaration of parentage, we ask that the court make an order that the intended parents are the legal parents of the child.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever had a case where there's a challenge to that?
No.
Surrogate doesn't change their mind.
Surrogates
it's not their baby. So
surrogates are very generally, the perspective of the surrogate is, this is definitely not my baby. Yeah. Let's make sure that this contract says so.
Don't stick me with this baby at the end of it.
And I mean, surrogates are amazing, right? Yeah. They're altruistically assisting a family in having a baby. And there's kind of different kinds of surrogates. Sometimes surrogates are a friend or close close friend or a family member of the intended parents. And sometimes they go through an agency and they're just women who really want to help another family have a baby.
Have you ever had a situation where, like you said, family members where they don't have these contracts in place? Like if it's like a close family member who offers to be a surrogate, or will a fertility center be like, absolutely not?
I don't know. I wouldn't probably be involved if that was the case. I assume that the clinic would want to have the agreement in place. Like we send a clearance letter to the clinic to say we have the surrogacy agreement in place. Right. And it's been completed before any embryo transfer. And in Nova Scotia, the criteria on surrogacy agreements is that they happen in advance of any pregnancy. There's different criteria about how when the surrogacy agreement is made and that it happens before any pregnancies, that they're not paid, it's only reimbursements, all that kind of stuff.
So we've talked about surrogates. That seems, for argument's sake, a little bit more, clear cut, right? Because it's not genetically their material, their biological material. When we get into then looking at sperm or egg donors, that seems a bit more gray. So what's the contract process, or what's the sort of legalities behind all of that?
Yeah, so egg donor agreements are pretty straightforward, and it's pretty easy to track where an egg came from.
Fair.
Because they are extracted in a medical procedure that happens at a fertility clinic, typically. And so an egg donor agreement typically stipulates, that these aren't going to be the egg donor's children, and just goes through. Also, there's more reimbursement in terms of costs associated for an egg donor, because it's a longer process, and there might be travel. There's all these other things. And so those agreements just go over clarifying all those rights and responsibilities from either side. A sperm donor agreement says the same thing, and then is a little bit more specific in terms of some of the details, and that could be specific, again, to provincial legislation. So, for instance, in Nova Scotia, the method of conception is relevant when it comes to the donation of sperm. There is no legislative provision that allows for donation of sperm by sexual intercourse. And so when a sperm donor is entering into a sperm donor agreement, the method of conception is necessary to be, discussed and also stipulated. And there's different kinds of people who are using sperm donors, right? There's people who are using sperm donors through a fertility clinic. They're going to donate at the fertility clinic. They're going to go through the assisted reproduction process. And you might have people who have already tried to get pregnant and are using a sperm donor because one of the intended parents who might have sperm might not have adequate sperm. That we're having this heterosexual couple who are attempting to get pregnant, and it's identified that a sperm donor would assist in that process. Right. Those people probably are already in the fertility clinic process. Yeah. But then you have other people who aren't. So you have queer couples who don't have any medical reason that they're not getting pregnant other than they don't have sperm. Yeah. And so those people might be doing an at-home insemination.
Are we talking turkey basters? Because I'm here for it.
No, or just the old-fashioned way.
Well, she said you can't.
You absolutely cannot. How are you going to know the difference?
So in Nova Scotia, you can't do...
but what if they do? Like, how are they going to know the difference?
And is that to protect people from just being like, oh, no, I had a one-night stand. I either want this baby or don't? Like, are we trying to eliminate that?
I guess I think that part of it is... Again, that the legislation hasn't caught up to the reality of the way society is, in that when the legislative drafters were putting together these provisions, they weren't thinking a queer couple might be attempting to have a baby, and are we differentiating between intercourse and the turkey baster method of at-home insemination?
That actually happened.
I feel like
turkey baster?
100%.
Like actually.
The turkey baster method is a method that I do believe happens and would be, I don't want to say the word common, but would be the perhaps preferred method for some queer couples that don't want to have to pay the price to use a fertility clinic.
The costs alone are insurmountable for some that want to start a family, and that's the barrier to entry. I don't know.
If you're looking at IUIs, so IUI is an intrauterine insemination, and it's a process where you either are like a medicated cycle where they induce your ovulation, or they increase the number of eggs that you're producing through medication. You can do a medicated cycle of IUI, and then the person who's providing the sperm goes to the clinic, they provide a sample, and then that sperm is washed and put directly into the uterus, intrauterine insemination. Right. That process, it can cost a few $1,000s. Yeah. And so...
And there's no guarantee.
And there's no guarantee. And if you're, a queer couple who has no particular fertility issues, you have no medical reason that you can't get pregnant, you haven't even ever tried to get pregnant, right? So, and you found a known sperm donor who is going to give you their sperm, then I think that you are gonna do the old turkey baster method at home.
It's worked for Betty.
So the advice from a legal standpoint is to, again, have that agreement in writing in advance that lays out the rights and responsibilities of the parties and what their expectations are going into the agreement. Yeah. Because the other part of it is that parentage has been proven by DNA for a really long time in our society. And the way that we prove that people are parents is with like a DNA test, right?
Yeah.
And so for the sperm donor, they want to be protected that after the birth of this child, that a DNA test doesn't suddenly have them on the hook for child support for a child that they never intended to parent. And it also then protects the intended parents from a claim from this sperm donor that they are a parent. Again, they can make that case and say, well, I'm a parent to this kid. Here's my DNA test that shows it, and I want parenting time.
Yeah.
I guess that's why a lot of people who are doing egg donors do a different egg than the surrogate, right? It's not the same person.
Yeah,
It
it's
takes
really
that little it's another level of protection.
And again,
I guess.
in the legislation in most places, the surrogate should not have a genetic link to the baby. Right. And again, that's a layer of when we're making that application for parentage, one of the criterias it is in Nova Scotia is that there's a genetic link to at least one of the intended parents. It can't be both, of course, but at least one of the genetic parents.
There should not be
that there has to be a genetic link to at least one of the intended parents, but there should not be a genetic link to the surrogate.
Right. But what if it's like a sister who's been
right?
a
So
surrogate
it
for
wouldn't
another
be their full biological.
Yeah. Right.
If you were using like an egg from your sister, you would typically use a different surrogate then. Not that everybody's doing that. There's lots of people that are doing lots of different things that aren't perfectly in line with what the law says. You know, I've had people come in and do different consults and say, like, you know, two women and say, we want to use this sperm donor and here's what we're thinking, and do we need an agreement? And of course my recommendation is yes. But I'm sure people don't, right? Like they just roll with the risks, and they every decision that we're making is just weighing risks. And so they might, all right, I trust this guy. I don't think he's going to make an application for parenting time, and let's go.
But again, like that's kind of what we do in marriage. And then after the fact, we have to go see our family lawyers, and we have to, you know, divide up all the stuff.
You can't do a prenup for your kids.
Well, exactly. But in many ways.
And for sperm donors, you know, we make the recommendation for sperm donors and egg donors. We make that recommendation that they put it in their will, that they say, I have acted as a sperm donor, and there are children that are born as a result of my donation, and they are not my biological children who I intend to inherit by, again, because all of these things we've proven parentage by DNA testing, right? And we would recommend it for egg donors as well, but it's a lot easier to prove donated eggs because you have to go to the fertility clinic to get those eggs out.
And I mean, you hear those horror stories, and maybe they're not fully accurate, but or certainly, I don't know, backpedal, where it's just like, I discovered I have like 20 siblings because dad was off to the sperm bank donating. And in Canada, we don't give money, right? Like, I think that's,
but that's sort of like a gray area too, because, okay, you're not going to pay me $50,000, but you can pay for my mortgage.
But you
car? Like it's
in the States when you can like go to a fertility and they're like, we'll give you $100 for each sample. Like literally they're buying your sperm. In Canada, I know, and correct me if I'm wrong though, please, you can't do that. So it is a little bit different. The likelihood of having, you know, tens of thousands of siblings just roaming the earth
isn't there.
Yes, they're not incentivized to donate. So it really is, I would imagine, more directive.
And if people are getting sperm or eggs from a donor bank, that's typically coming from the United States.
They are paying for that.
They're not purchasing the sperm. We cannot purchase sperm or eggs in Canada. They can pay for a service to obtain those things.
Great.
Same.
Exactly. Sure.
So I have a question, because like I said in the beginning that this egg freezing, I feel like it's gone like viral. So many people are freezing their eggs. So if, let's say, a woman comes into your office and single in their 30s, wants to freeze their eggs, what are some do's and don'ts to like protect her reproductive material?
Yeah, so all of that would pretty much happen at the fertility clinic level. The they'll do all of that kind of stuff. There'll be documentation that the fertility clinic will want people to sign prior to. Our recommendation would be on estate planning, when they're at the estate planning stage, that they make provision for what happens with those eggs upon their death, if they die with eggs or embryos or whatever in storage. We would suggest that they
imagine parents were like, no, I'm going to save these for my kids in case they can't
That's
have
their
a baby,
sibling?
but then
Have
it's
your
like their
sibling?
sibling slash
their
child.
sibling?
I know, but
listen, it's hard to get like embryos, man. I
That's the
have
thing. What do you-
embryos in storage right now. I made embryos in 2017. I had 2 kids from the same batch of embryos. And I am probably done having kids.
Yeah.
I have given away, my youngest is 2.5.
Okay.
I've given away all my baby stuff, but paying those fees every year, it's hard to let go. It was hard to get those embryos.
Yeah, you worked
You
so
worked
hard.
so hard.
And so I think that you do see people who continue to pay storage on embryos
Rainy day.
for
You never know.
a period of time that they can't kind of figure out what to do with.
Yeah.
So after divorce, then
Mhm.
do these embryos, do they get destroyed, or do they?
Yeah, so there's kind of 3 options of what you can do with embryos when you no longer want to use them. You can destroy them.
Yeah.
You can donate them to science.
Oh.
And that's pretty much that they're used for, the training of new embryologists,
Okay.
that the clinic uses them in their own like training research, that kind of thing, the thawing and the unthawing processes, perhaps mock transfers, things, not mock transfers to people, but just like transfer the process, those kinds of things. So the clinic might use your embryos if you no longer want them for that kind of thing. And then the other option would be embryo donation. And that would be that you would donate your embryos to another, family, people who were looking to create a family, but haven't been able to or haven't wanted to make embryos. So, if you have, instead of getting donor eggs, perhaps people are looking for like donated embryos as a whole.
Interesting. I would imagine, and tell me if you've come across this. So you, let's say, have 1 or 2 kids. You then realize, okay, it's not working out with my partner. We're separating, we're divorcing. Now we've got, let's say, 1 or 2 embryos left. Couldn't you imagine, maybe, and especially if you only had 1 child, being like, well, we have to co-parent anyways. I really wanted a second baby, or I want a sibling for, the first child.
Right.
Why not just give her? You're creating a parenting plan anyways. You're shuttling kids back and forth. It doesn't seem that implausible.
To have another baby.
And in that case, I guess then really the questions for you here as our expert is, you're just factoring that in as like another child, part of the, divorce separation agreement. Have you seen that before?
I haven't.
Okay, well, you call me when it happens, because I bet you it's going
But I think
to.
similar to that would be, what if there's a surrogacy process in place and then the couple separates?
Yeah, so it's also
Right?
that
So
is
sort of
included in
similar
our
to that.
in our surrogacy agreements.
Yeah.
So included in the surrogacy agreements will be, that we talk to our intended parents about in advance. In the event that you separate during the duration of the surrogate's pregnancy, which parent should the child be placed with upon birth? And so it doesn't change who the parents legally will be in the end, but at the moment of birth, surrogates are at the hospital or sometimes at home, but whatever. And intended parents are generally also at the hospital. Sometimes they're in the delivery room. It kind of depends on the situation. But who will that baby be placed with upon birth? And we make that decision in advance. Surrogacy contracts are extremely comprehensive. They're very long, and they take into account basically anything that could happen during the pregnancy, even before the pregnancy. What happens if the intended parents die? What happens if they separate? What happens if all these different things happen? We go through all those provisions in our surrogacy contracts to make sure that hopefully every scenario is contemplated in advance, so that if it happens, we've already thought about it.
What about how much let's say, sort of voiced does the surrogate have? Like, what if I am very religious, for example, and I don't want to be a carrier, a surrogate for a couple who's divorced because that goes against my religious beliefs. Now you're pregnant, you're separating.
I'm keeping the baby?
Like what?
Sorry, mine now?
Like, do you have to include provisions for the surrogate around like how much say they have in proceedings? Do they basically just give up all choice, like all, not rights obviously, but all say in the matter?
So that would likely be contemplated in advance, like when you were in the process of doing the surrogacy agreement, if someone felt that strongly about divorce or whatever it was, it would probably be discussed at the time. In terms of the medical procedures, surrogates, agree in advance what they may or may not be willing to do in terms of medical procedures, but ultimately a person who has full autonomy over their own medical procedures. And so they have the ability to make, whatever medical choices that they intend. So we'll put in included in the agreements will be things like if the intended parents want to attend ultrasounds or want to attend the birth or things like that. But at the time of the birth, if the surrogate's like, actually, no thanks, I'd rather no one else but my support person be in the room with me, well, then that is what it is, right? Surrogates get the kind of decision on that. And then the intention being that at the birth, that the baby be immediately placed with the intended parents upon birth. And so we write to the hospital in advance of that, and they know what's happening. The OB will know, the nurse manager on the OB floor will typically know, when a surrogate, there's a lot of appointments when you're pregnant. And so it's not like the surrogate rolls into the hospital and this is the first time that their care team knows that they have a surrogate that could possibly be giving birth.
Yeah.
So when the baby comes out, immediately they usually put it on mom's chest, right?
Mm-hmm.
They put it on the intended mom or intended dad or whomever it is chest.
Yeah.
Wow.
Typically,
and they're waiting there like in a gown, just wow.
Yeah.
Incredible.
And so we would typically, again, talk about it in advance and have that plan in advance. We would write a letter to the hospital, a joint letter of intention between the intended parents as well as the surrogate that says just that. At birth, I would like for the baby to be placed with the intended mom or intended dad, whatever, by name, who the plan is. We ran into some issues during COVID when there were restrictions on the number of people that were allowed in delivery rooms. For a while in delivery rooms, you can only have one support person, and the surrogate's going to want to have their own support person, whether that's their spouse or their sister or whatever. And so we did see that hospitals were making exceptions for families who were having babies born by surrogacy that said, the COVID rule is to have one person, but we will allow for there to be two people. We understand that this is special circumstances and
that's
that
nice to hear.
the baby and one of the intended parents can be in the room. And again, in ORs, if a baby's being born by C-section, typically it's one person. We have seen that hospitals make allowances that say, okay, for this particular birth, because it's a little, it's not run-of-the-mill birth, that an intended parent can be in the room as well. And again, surrogates get the kind of final call if it comes to it and they don't want that to happen, then that's okay. But surrogates are they want the intended parents to have that experience of the birth, and they're doing it for the intended parents.
It's different than an adoption situation where a biological parent is giving up parentage at birth, right? I think that would be a little bit of a different situation than a surrogate.
I would imagine a lot of that paperwork is quite similar though, adoption, like the parents, the biological parents sort of giving up their parental obligations, their parental rights and handing the baby over to somebody else, signing away all of those future forward?
Yeah, so because again, there's so many assumptions that happen in the law. The law assumes so many things. One of the things that the law assumes in lots of places is that if you give birth to a baby, it's yours.
Yeah.
Right. And so when babies are being born by surrogate, that's just not the case. But in Nova Scotia, there's another upon the birth of a baby, essentially the surrogate will sign a form that says that they're refusing to act as the decision maker for the baby. So, if a baby when they're born needs medical treatment or medical attention of some kind, typically the person who gets to make the decisions about that is the birth mom, the person who just gave birth.
Right.
But so what our surrogates will do is they'll refuse to make the decisions, and then the substitute decision maker, being the biological parents, then would make decisions. And so it's just like a kind of funny step that needs to happen where the surrogate needs to refuse, and then but we prep that in advance.
Right.
Here are the forms that say that she's going to refuse. We send it all together to the hospital, and if she needs to sign something again after the birth, she is willing to do so. And yeah.
And similarly, I would imagine paperwork drawn up in advance of medical decisions while pregnant. Is it your body? Is it the baby? Like, and how are those lines? I would imagine quite blurry. You really do need to account for every possible outcome, every emergency, health-related
what
matter.
if there's something that there's a procedure that the baby
Well, that's
needs
what I
while
mean.
in utero
That could complicate the health of the mother,
right?
The surrogate, like the carrier.
Yeah,
you have to anticipate all of this. Yeah.
A lot of those things in advance. But again, when it comes to it, a person has autonomy over their own body. But we do contemplate all sorts of different things that could occur, and also restrict different activities for the surrogate. We restrict travel for surrogates to a certain extent. We don't know how every single part of the world, part of the United States, is going to treat a surrogate birth. And so we restrict travel for surrogates past a certain point in pregnancy, and ask that they not travel outside of Nova Scotia for a period of time to ensure that we know what the rules are upon birth. We don't want a surrogate traveling when they're 36 weeks pregnant to a province or state that we don't know how they're going to treat a surrogate birth.
Yeah, that's so important. And then one more question that I thought of earlier that I want to kind of go back to. So you mentioned some folks getting donor sperm or donor eggs from, let's say, outside of their jurisdiction. I would imagine in smaller towns or places where you might know the donor, this is more common. You kind of want to cast a wider net. Is that the rationale, or it's just more
I don't think that it is.
Okay.
I think that some people have people in their life that they would ask to be a sperm donor, and some people don't.
Right.
And so some people, I don't know that it has really anything to do with like where people are located or anything like that. I think it's just that, you have a close family member or a friend or something like that who you could or would ask to or act as a donor for you. And not everybody has that.
Fair. I just feel like, imagine, you are living in a town of like 500, and then one day your kid opens the door and it's the mailman and it looks exactly like them, and you're like, wait just a minute.
And I think with their siblings,
I think that a lot of, when it's because there's known donors and then there's anonymous donors.
Right.
I think that a lot of times when it's known donors now at this particular time in history, the kids know that they're donor conceived.
Right.
And they're not, it's not a surprise to them. I think a lot of kids know that they're, donor conceived, or they were carried by a surrogate, or they whatever.
Yeah. No, it's so
Whatever
true.
the case
It's less,
might be.
secretive and hush hush.
It used to be
now.
very different. Even like
Yeah,
looking
it
at
used to
open
be.
adoption versus closed
Right.
adoptions, like you really don't see closed anymore. They really believe that there should be, all of this information, and you should meet your biological parents if you want to, and maintain any sort of relationship that you do. And I think that helps just in terms of like medical history and any questions you might have as a child growing up with a different set of parents. It's so fascinating. Okay, so last final thing, unless you have something,
Go
because
ahead.
I just want to circle back to kind of like last minute tips for our listeners. So estate planning, I think, is more important than we've really given airtime to. If you have any biological material out in the world, you need to have that captured in your will.
But or what happens? What happens if it's not in your
Or
will?
what happens?
I mean, maybe nothing. Maybe after you die, it just gets destroyed and that's that.
Right.
But if you want something specific to happen to that genetic material, then talk about it.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm a lawyer and I'm going to say you should always make these considerations and things like that. But you don't want someone to be challenging your will
Yeah.
if you were a sperm donor to say that they, get a cut of your fortune if that's
Right?
not what you wanted to happen,
Yeah.
right? And making your lawyer aware. And the other thing, just in general about, fertility law issues and surrogacy and potential intended parents who are trying to figure things out, like you can talk to a lawyer and they can give you the information that you're looking for. I know lots of people are trying to find all the information by just like looking it up or anecdotally or those kinds of things, but you can call a lawyer.
I would say not only can you, but you should. Yeah, like please do, right? Because there are so many considerations. I mean, we work in this field, and I have yet to come across a case, I will say, in my own practice where this is an issue, embryos, donors, any of that sort of stuff. So to your earlier point, it's rare that it is going to come up, but
maybe it's not. Maybe it's
I think
down
more
the
and more
pipeline.
will see
that
it.
you know that you know
I think
of.
it's
Some of those
coming down the
people could be
pipeline.
paying their storage fees still.
Exactly.
Section 7 expense.
Yes. But it is,
Section 7 expense.
Oh, our family law jokes.
So good.
So good.
No one else is laughing but the three of us.
Just the mediation and lawyers.
That was funny. I get it.
I love it. But yes, we will probably be seeing it more and more.
Yeah.
So put it in your intake forms, professionals who are listening and people that are listening, make sure you know where your biological material is.
Well, I think it's a generational thing too. I think the younger generation is doing this more. They're freezing eggs. They're having embryos. They're doing IVF. So it's it's going to come. It's going to come, and we just have to be prepared.
And technology continues to advance, right?
Yes.
So we continue to, up until the last 3 or 4 years, if you were someone who makes sperm and you were facing cancer treatment, you could extract sperm fairly easily and freeze it. But if you were a person who has eggs who is facing a cancer treatment, you might not have time to go through the entire process, get eggs, have them frozen, that kind of thing. But technology has advanced, and so now there are ways that you can extract immature eggs and freeze them or mature them outside of the body. So those options are existing, and we're going to see more and more of these things happening as technology continues to advance, and maybe the cost comes down because in order to freeze eggs you need 15 grand. And so some people have access to that kind of money. I have kids because I am lucky that IVF worked and also was able to pay for it.
Yeah. Well, and you see companies that are now offering that as part of their like health insurance package.
IVF.
No,
is fertility
paying for egg freezing.
Oh, okay.
Again, this is anecdotal. I don't have any facts. I heard Netflix is doing it because they want their employees to be able to work and to make decisions, when they can and want to, not because they're forced into it.
Yeah, there are companies, definitely if you're living in the infertility space, the content creators, the Facebook support groups, all those kinds, there are companies that have fertility benefits and the infertility spaces. They know what companies those are, and people will work, change jobs to work at companies that have fertility benefits.
I mean, let's be honest. People switch companies and jobs to work for companies that have good
dental benefits.
Well, no, I mean, yes, but also just parental leave benefits, right?
Yeah.
Like, especially as more men, again, in, typical hetero relationships are wanting to take a pat leave, they are looking for companies that are supportive of that versus ones that slowly kick you to the curb for, having the audacity to want to take time off. So it's not surprising, but yeah, we're going to see more and more of it. And
I think there's some government assistance, isn't there? I think
for first round
fertility. I think.
Was that
Again,
an Ontario
it's dependent
thing?
on jurisdiction.
Yeah, I think it's an Ontario thing.
So Ontario, I think, is first round if you're able to get on that program.
Yeah.
Nova Scotia has a rebate program. PEI has a rebate program. Different provinces have different programs and process. Quebec's is pretty strong. But yeah, different provinces have different.
It's good to know that support
again, healthcare is provincially regulated, so it's dependent on that.
Oh, Tracy, this has been so fascinating. And as things change, you'll have to just come back and update us so that we know what's going on. Yes. Thank you for taking this time with us. So informative, so wonderful. Good luck with your practice. And if folks are in Nova Scotia and they want to find you because they're going through all of this, how do they do that?
You can. I'm on Instagram. My Tracy Bannier. My Instagram handle is Tracy Fertility Lawyer. I'm highly Googleable, so Tracy Bannier. You can kind of find me anywhere.
Good, and we'll throw it all in the show notes, anyways, for our listeners. But thank you, and we appreciate you.
Awesome.
Take care.
Take care.
Thanks.
This episode was written and created by Alex Howard and Amanda Silver, produced, edited, and engineered by RTF Productions. Make sure to rate and review our show if you loved it, and give us a follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you stream your podcast to stay up to date on all upcoming episodes. Thanks for listening, and go easy on us. We're not your ex.